You remember the first time they sneered. It wasn't a loud thing, not a shout or a slur, but it was just as cutting. You were young then, fresh out of training, eager to serve, to prove yourself. You'd come from a small town where your dreams were constantly met with raised eyebrows. What were you, a girl, doing wanting to join the military? But you brushed it off. After all, this wasn't high school. This was a mission. This was the real world. You could handle it. But once you got into the thick of it, the small sneers turned into something more deliberate. "You'll never last," they whispered behind your back, louder now. Some laughed, others rolled their eyes. They said it was just a phase, that women weren't cut out for combat, that this was a man's world, a man's fight. You had thick skin, you told yourself, but every time they looked at you like you didn't belong, something chipped away inside. This wasn't how you pictured it. The pride you expected to feel from serving your country was overshadowed by the ridicule that never stopped. Some days, it felt like they had more faith in the weather than in your ability to endure. But you couldn't turn back. You'd already made a promise to yourself that this wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about something deeper. It was about showing yourself that you could take on anything, no matter what they said. You gritted your teeth and carried on, even when you felt invisible in a room full of men. The stares in the locker rooms, the way your equipment never seemed to fit, the glances from others that said, "What are you doing here?" You wanted to scream, to yell at them all for being so narrow-minded, but you didn't. Instead, you focused. You worked harder than anyone else, your eyes always forward, never looking back. But no matter how many times you passed the physical tests, completed the missions, earned your stripes, their sneers never stopped. It was a battle on two fronts. You fought for survival, for success, for recognition in an unforgiving environment, and you fought against the quiet doubt gnawing at your own confidence. The day you were deployed, they didn't say goodbye like they did to the others. They didn't think you'd make it. But you did. You came back. You survived. And yet when you came home, the sneers didn't stop. They just took a new form. The journey didn't get easier once you returned home. If anything, it became more complicated. The same people who had silently doubted you during your service now looked at you as though you were a ghost, a reminder of something they didn't want to acknowledge. Your uniform had been replaced with civilian clothes, but the invisible armor you had worn for years, the one that shielded you from the world's judgments, was gone. And in its absence, you were forced to confront a different kind of challenge, the struggle to fit back into a world that seemed like it had moved on without you. You had been to war, but now it felt like you were fighting a war on your own soil. The initial relief of returning to family and familiar surroundings faded quickly as people began to treat you as a stranger. Friends and family were kind, but their questions were loaded with an unspoken discomfort. They didn't know what to say to someone who had seen things they couldn't understand. The stares, the awkward silences, they hurt in ways the war never had. And then there was the world outside. You had seen firsthand how quickly the news moved on from soldiers, from veterans, from the stories that were never truly told. The public face of the military was always male, always someone they could relate to. But when a woman returned from war, she didn't fit into the narrative they had built. She wasn't the image of strength they were familiar with, and so she was forgotten, dismissed. There were no banners waiting for you when you came home. No parades, no public recognition. The local veterans groups had little to offer women, and the ones that did seemed like an afterthought. If you wanted to speak about your experiences, you were often met with silence, or worse, condescension. The Veterans Affairs Office, they had plenty of pamphlets for male soldiers, but the ones for women? Far fewer. It wasn't that anyone outright told you that your service wasn't as valuable, but it was clear in the way they looked at you. They didn't know how to include you in the fold. The sneers from before were no longer confined to the barracks or training fields. They had seeped into the civilian world. They had morphed into pity, and worse, skepticism. You heard the whispers behind your back. "What's she even doing here?" they'd say. "She doesn't belong in this world." You were a reminder of a truth people didn't want to see, that women could be soldiers too, that the battlefield didn't care about gender, that the work you did, the sacrifices you made, mattered just as much as anyone else's. Yet the more you tried to explain, to make them understand, the more it felt like you were pushing a boulder uphill. Even when the headlines about veteran affairs showed the staggering numbers of homeless veterans or the struggles to get proper care, no one asked how women veterans were faring. It was always our brave soldiers. But the truth was, the women who had fought, bled, and sacrificed were pushed further into the margins. And you knew it. You saw it in the faces of the women who came back with the same struggles, the same empty stares, the same yearning for acknowledgement. But you didn't stop. You couldn't. You knew that if the world wasn't ready to listen, then you would have to make them hear. The more you reached out to fellow female veterans, the more you realized that this wasn't an isolated experience. It was a shared one. Women who had served in every branch of the military, who had faced the same obstacles, who had been ignored and overlooked, were scattered across the country, just waiting for someone to see them, to hear them. The idea of community began to take root. Women started coming together in small support groups, some online, others in person. You heard stories that mirrored yours of women who had served with pride and who were now living in silence. But together, you found strength. You found solidarity. You found your voice. The world didn't change overnight. The old wounds didn't magically heal. But in those moments when you sat with other women who understood exactly what you had been through, when you shared your stories and your anger and your frustration, there was a sense of relief. You weren't alone. You weren't invisible. You weren't a ghost. You were a veteran, one who deserved to be recognized. And with every conversation, every shared experience, a collective resolve started to build. You weren't just fighting for recognition anymore. You were fighting for change. The world had to know that women had served, that they had bled and died for this country just as much as any man. And if the systems in place didn't want to listen, then you would force them to. The turning point came when you least expected it. It wasn't a grand gesture, not some dramatic speech in front of thousands. It was simpler than that, just a moment of pure honesty. You were sitting in a quiet coffee shop, the weight of everything you had been carrying sitting heavy on your shoulders. You were tired of being ignored, tired of explaining yourself, tired of waiting for the world to catch up to you. But that day, something inside you shifted. A fellow female veteran, someone you had met through one of the support groups, had invited you to meet up. You'd seen her name online before, read her story, but had never spoken in person. She sat down across from you with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. You could see it in her. She was carrying the same weight. The silence between you both stretched for a few moments. Then she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she started, "about how we're overlooked, ignored, as if our service doesn't count." Her words hit a chord, and you didn't hold back. You found yourself pouring out everything you had been feeling for years. The bitterness of being dismissed, the loneliness of being a woman in a male-dominated environment, the constant reminder that your service was somehow less valuable. She nodded in understanding, her face reflecting your own frustration. As you spoke, you realized something. You were no longer trying to convince anyone that you belonged. You weren't trying to win approval. You were simply telling your truth, and in that you found a kind of freedom. She listened, not with sympathy, but with solidarity. And as you shared your pain, you also shared a new kind of strength. You began to see that by speaking out, by simply telling the truth, you could begin to change things. You could help change the narrative, because the truth had always been there. You were just the one brave enough to say it out loud. From that moment, you knew things had to change. And more importantly, you knew you couldn't do it alone. You started organizing, reaching out to other women who had served. You began speaking out, not just for yourself, but for every woman who had ever put on the uniform and had been left behind in the conversation. You were done being a passive participant in your own story. Now, you were taking the lead. It wasn't easy. The media didn't rush to cover your movement, and many of the men in your life still struggled to understand what you were trying to say. Some believed that the military was a place of ultimate equality, that once you signed up, you were no longer a man or a woman. You were just a soldier. And in some ways, they were right. But they were also wrong. Being a soldier didn't erase the gendered struggles you faced. It didn't mean that you didn't have to fight harder to be seen, to be heard. The more you spoke, the more the cracks in the system began to show. The way women veterans were treated, or not treated, had never truly been acknowledged. The questions started to rise. Why weren't more women being included in the conversation? Why was there so little support for women who had served, who had given so much of themselves? Slowly, the people around you began to realize that the issues you were raising weren't just about gender. They were about the core values of honor, respect, and equality. But not everyone was ready to listen. Some people, especially those who had never experienced the military firsthand, were quick to dismiss your concerns. They said you were overreacting, that the military was doing just fine when it came to supporting its veterans, especially women. The VA, Veterans Affairs, had a whole department dedicated to women's health care, they argued, but you knew better. The Women's Health Division was often understaffed, underfunded, and overlooked by the larger VA system. The resources that were supposed to be there for you and others like you were far from adequate. Many women didn't even know they existed. And even if they did, the stigma surrounding asking for help made it difficult for many to reach out. Veterans in the online forums still argued over the same tired points. The military doesn't discriminate. It's about performance. Yes, the military didn't care about gender when it came to the battlefield, but it sure cared about it when it came to everything else. The uniforms that didn't fit, the limited resources for women, the token recognition when it came time to honor veterans. Women were still fighting for equality, but now they were fighting on two fronts, on the battlefield and back home, where the battle for respect was just as fierce. But there were victories too. The more women spoke out, the louder their voices became. The more stories that were shared, the harder it was for the world to ignore. What started as a quiet conversation over coffee began to echo across social media, in support groups, in news articles. Slowly, other veterans started to speak up. Women who had served in every branch of the military began sharing their stories, writing op-eds, talking to reporters, organizing protests. The more they shared, the clearer it became that this wasn't just an isolated issue. This was a systemic problem that had been ignored for far too long. It was hard to tell who was listening, who was truly absorbing the weight of the message. But you kept going. Every time you saw another woman speaking out, it gave you the strength to keep going. Every time you read about a woman's story, about the battles they had fought, not just on foreign soil but in the halls of Veterans Affairs offices, it made your voice stronger. You knew the fight wasn't over yet. But now you were part of a growing movement, a movement of women who weren't going to let the world forget what they had done. You weren't just raising your voice anymore. You were raising the voices of all the women who had been silenced, and you were doing it in a way that no one could ignore. And you weren't alone anymore. The silence was deafening, but it was also revealing. The truth you had spent years concealing, both the physical and emotional toll of service, could no longer be ignored. Women veterans were speaking out, but were people truly listening? Did anyone care that after returning from war you had to fight battles on home soil that no one had prepared you for? You tried to make people understand that your service had not ended when you took off your uniform. There was a new war, one fought against apathy, against the refusal to acknowledge that your sacrifice was just as real as any man's. But every time you raised your voice, there was that same quiet judgment. People didn't know how to handle your experience, your pain. They didn't know how to fit you into the narrative they had created. And so, they tried to ignore it. One afternoon, a breakthrough happened, and it wasn't a loud, dramatic revelation. It was a moment of connection with someone who saw the world as you did. A journalist from a major publication who had been following the struggle of women veterans reached out to you. She had heard about your efforts and wanted to know more. You met her for coffee, feeling the familiar weight of skepticism pressing down on your chest. What would this conversation change, you wondered? Would she even be able to understand? You sat across from her, and, surprisingly, she didn't ask the usual questions. She didn't start by asking you to talk about your military service or your battles in combat. She simply asked, "How does it feel to not be seen? How does it feel to give everything for a country that forgets you the moment you come home?" The question stunned you. It wasn't a question you had been asked before, not by any therapist, not by any other reporter, not by any well-meaning family member. It wasn't about the combat or the physical injuries, not about the medals or the scars you wore. It was about the unseen part of service, the quiet sacrifice, the emotional burden of knowing that, no matter how hard you fought, you would always be expected to fight harder to be heard, to be recognized, to be given what you deserved. You found yourself tearing up, but it wasn't because of the sympathy you thought you needed. It was because she finally, truly understood. And in that moment, you realized something. This was what had been missing all along. The acknowledgement that the struggle didn't stop when you took off the uniform. The realization that being a woman in the military was not just about fighting for your country, but about fighting for a space where your service mattered. The article that followed went viral. It wasn't just about your personal journey. It was about the systemic issues women veterans faced. It highlighted the inequality within the military and the veteran community, and it began a conversation that was long overdue. You weren't the only one telling your story anymore. Now there were others, hundreds, thousands, coming forward, their voices rising in unison. This was no longer just your fight. It was a movement. As the article made its rounds across social media, more women veterans began sharing their experiences. Some were angry, others heartbroken, but all were united in their frustration. The stories started to pile up. Stories of discrimination in the military, stories of being overlooked when it came time to seek care, stories of returning home to find that the world had moved on without them. Each voice added weight to the growing movement. And then, the twist you hadn't expected happened. The men began to listen. They weren't all quick to admit it, but slowly, some started acknowledging the systemic issues within the military, the way women were treated. The military wasn't perfect, they realized, and the Veterans Affairs system wasn't as fair and equitable as they had believed. Slowly, a shift was taking place, a change in the narrative. The military wasn't just a place for men. It was a place for anyone who was willing to serve, male, female, or non-binary. Of course, there were still doubters. There were still those who refused to admit the problem. But as more women began to share their stories, the conversation became impossible to ignore. The media couldn't hide it anymore. The veteran community couldn't turn away from it. You weren't the only one crying out for recognition now. You saw changes, slow but meaningful. Veterans Affairs offices began offering better support for women, from mental health services to financial assistance. Policies started shifting, and though they weren't perfect, they were better than what they had been before. A new generation of women was finding a place for themselves in the military and the veteran community, where they could be heard, seen, and respected. And then, there were the little things that made it all feel worthwhile. The thank yous you received from civilians who didn't know what you had been through, but appreciated the fight you had led. The recognition from fellow veterans who had always believed in equality and who stood with you as allies. The conversations about gender inequality and military service that began happening in schools, on social media, in offices. It wasn't just about you anymore. It was about the future, the possibility that women who came after you wouldn't have to fight as hard as you did. And you felt a flicker of hope, one you hadn't allowed yourself to feel for so long. Maybe, just maybe, the world was starting to listen. The tide of change wasn't always smooth, but it was unmistakably gathering strength. You watched it all unfold with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. The conversations that had once felt like solitary battles fought alone in the quiet of your mind were now reverberating through the halls of government, across military communities, and into the homes of those who had once turned a blind eye. The system that had once seemed impenetrable was now cracking open, one story at a time. As more women came forward, their voices began to have a tangible impact. New policies were being proposed, ones that would ensure that women who had served in the military wouldn't just be an afterthought. Healthcare, mental health support, and representation, These were just a few of the areas where progress was beginning to show. It wasn't a perfect system, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it was progress. It was a sign that the fight was not for nothing. One day you were invited to speak at a roundtable discussion about veteran care. It was a small but powerful moment. You walked into a room full of lawmakers, military leaders, and advocates for veterans' rights, all sitting around a polished table waiting for you to speak. You felt the weight of the room as you sat down, but you also felt something else, a sense of power, of purpose. You had a voice now. You had a platform. This wasn't just about you anymore. It was about every woman who had ever served and been forgotten, every woman who had been asked to prove herself time and time again. When you spoke, your words were deliberate. You talked about the lack of recognition for women veterans. You spoke about the challenges of navigating a system built primarily for men, of being a woman in a space that often made you feel like an outsider. You shared your story, but you also spoke for those who couldn't be there, for those who were still struggling to be seen. You didn't hold back, not even a little. The response was mixed. Some of the men in the room shifted uncomfortably, not used to hearing these truths from a woman. Others nodded, silently acknowledging that they hadn't considered the issues from your perspective. But one thing was clear. You had their attention. One of the lawmakers, a woman who had served in the military herself, stood up at the end of the meeting. "This isn't just your fight," she said. "This is all of ours." Her words resonated deeply with you. For so long you had felt like you were carrying the burden alone, but now you were no longer alone. You were part of a movement that had gained momentum, one that couldn't be ignored. And then there was the ripple effect. Your words didn't just stay within the confines of that room. They spread beyond it, carried by news outlets, social media platforms, and the growing network of women veterans who were ready to speak up. The pressure on lawmakers and military leaders to address the inequalities that women veterans faced continued to build. Some resisted, of course. There were still people who dismissed the issue, who said things like, "Women are just as capable as men, so what's the problem?" But you knew that the problem wasn't about ability, it was about visibility. The problem wasn't about whether or not women could serve, it was about the fact that their service had been largely invisible in the broader narrative. As you continued to speak, to advocate, to demand recognition, more and more people started to understand what you were fighting for. It was no longer just a matter of ensuring that women had equal access to resources or health care. It was about ensuring that their service was valued. It was about ensuring that women who had put their lives on the line for this country would be honored with the same respect as their male counterparts. But the battle was far from over. While you celebrated the small victories, you knew there was much more work to be done. The stories of women veterans like yourself were still not fully represented in history. The contributions of women in the military were often overlooked or downplayed, and the services available to them still lagged behind those offered to male veterans. The fight for equality was ongoing, and you were determined to stay in the fight for as long as it took. And it wasn't just about policy changes or public recognition. It was about changing the culture. It was about creating a world where no woman who served in the military would ever again have to feel like an outsider in the veteran community. It was about ensuring that young girls who looked up to women in uniform would grow up knowing that their service would be just as valued, just as important as anyone else's. Every conversation, every story shared, added to the shift in public perception. The world was starting to understand that the narrative of the military, of veterans, could no longer be told without acknowledging the vital contributions of women. The walls were slowly coming down, and women veterans were finally being recognized for the heroes they were. But there were still moments when you had to stop and remind yourself of how far you had come. You had faced ridicule, been told you didn't belong, and fought for years to be seen, to be heard. And yet now you were leading a charge that would help future generations of women veterans avoid the same battles you had fought. You knew that while the fight was far from over, the momentum was undeniable. Change was in the air. The realization hit you slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, When you started this journey, all you had was your voice, and yet in time it became a chorus, a movement. The long and silent fight for recognition, for equality, for the simple acknowledgement of your service had blossomed into something larger than you ever expected. The fight wasn't just for women veterans anymore, it was for every veteran whose sacrifices had been minimized or ignored. And that was the power of collective action. When one voice becomes many, the world has no choice but to listen. The changes, while still incremental, were starting to show. In the halls of government, veterans' organizations began to implement reforms, making the system more inclusive, more sensitive to the specific needs of women veterans. Healthcare and mental health services were slowly expanding to include the unique challenges that women faced. The Veterans Affairs Office started offering more resources for female veterans, including specialized care and counseling. But the road was still long, and you knew it wouldn't be an easy journey. You also knew that public opinion was one of the hardest battlegrounds to win. While lawmakers and institutions could change policies, true cultural change took longer. Society had to come to terms with the idea that the military wasn't an exclusively male domain, that women who served deserved recognition not as anomalies, but as part of the fabric of the nation's defense. The stories had to be told, and they had to be heard. So you kept pushing, kept speaking out, kept writing and organizing. It wasn't easy. Some days, it felt like the same conversations kept circling back to the same points. Stories of discrimination, of women being passed over for opportunities, of being told they didn't belong in spaces where they had bled and fought for this country. But you knew that the more you repeated the truth, the harder it would be for people to continue ignoring it. Social media became a powerful tool in your hands. The digital age was both a blessing and a curse, but in this fight, it was undeniably an ally. Veterans from all over the country began sharing their stories, offering their support, and speaking out in ways they never had before. The hashtag #WomenVeteransMatter began trending, and soon it was impossible for people to avoid the discussion. Stories of service, sacrifice, and resilience filled every corner of the internet. The movement had gone viral, but this wasn't just another hashtag, it was a call to action. It was the beginning of a broader societal shift. Women veterans weren't going to be swept under the rug any longer. Their stories would be heard, and their voices would be amplified. As the years passed, more women joined the ranks of military leadership and advocacy. Many of them had lived through the same struggles you had, but now they were in positions to influence policy, to challenge the system from within. Slowly, but surely, the military and the Veterans Affairs system began to reflect the reality of modern service, where men and women fought side by side, where their experiences mattered equally. And with each passing day, you realized something profound. This wasn't just about being recognized in the military community. It was about the ripple effect on the wider world. Because the truth was, when women were treated as equals in the military, they were more likely to be treated as equals in every other aspect of society. The fight for women veterans' rights was a microcosm of the larger battle for gender equality. The challenges faced by women in the military mirrored those faced by women everywhere. If women could fight for their place in the military, they could fight for their place in every room, every conversation, every field. One evening, a young woman approached you after a speech you gave at a veterans event. Her eyes were wide with admiration, but there was a question lingering in her gaze. "I've been thinking about joining the military," she said, "but I've been told it's not a place for women. What do you think?" You looked at her, and in that moment, you saw something in her eyes that mirrored your own years ago. The same fire, the same hunger to prove that she could do it. "I think," you said, "that the military needs women like you. The world needs women who know their worth, who are ready to fight for their place, to make space for others like you. If you want to serve, then you deserve to be there. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise." That moment stuck with you long after the event was over. It was a quiet reminder that all of this mattered. All the struggles, all the frustrations, all the late nights spent in meetings, all the personal sacrifices, it was all worth it if it meant paving the way for women like her, women who could follow their dreams without hesitation, who could wear the uniform without fear of being dismissed. And so, you keep going. For the women who came before you, for the women who are coming after you, for the women who aren't afraid to raise their voices, to demand recognition, to stand shoulder to shoulder with the men who have long held the mantle of heroism. For the future that promises a world where a woman in uniform is just as respected, just as celebrated as any man. Your fight isn't over yet, but the path is clearer than ever. And you know deep down that the next generation of women veterans won't have to fight the same battles you did. They'll inherit a world that is more inclusive, more understanding, and most importantly, more willing to acknowledge the equal sacrifice and service of all veterans, regardless of gender. The world is changing, slowly but surely, and you were part of that change.